The midday sun cast harsh rays over the dusty lot of the Fairbanks Sled Dog Auction. The wooden pens rattled as restless dogs paced inside, their thick coats already matted with dirt. A crowd of mushers, trainers, and traders moved between the enclosures, inspecting the animals with a practiced eye. "This one's got speed," one man said, nodding toward a lean Siberian Husky. "I'll give you 500 if he's got endurance," another muttered, running a hand down the dog's muscular flank. Voices buzzed like insects, deals being made, futures being decided. But in the farthest pen, away from the lively negotiations, lay a dog no one wanted. Smokey, once the pride of the sled team, now curled in the corner of his enclosure, his thick Alaskan husky coat dull and unkempt. His left front leg bore the scars of his last race. A brutal, frozen march through a blizzard that had ended in collapse. Torn ligaments. Too much damage. Too slow to keep up. Not worth the kibble. A trainer scoffed as he passed by. Another man glanced at Smokey and sneered. "Can't run, can't pull. Ain't no use." Smokey didn't lift his head. He had heard it all before. The auctioneer finally reached his enclosure, clearing his throat. His usual enthusiasm for fast, strong dogs was gone as he glanced down at the useless animal before him. "We got an Alaskan Husky here," he called out half-heartedly. Former lead dog. Real strong bloodline, but he hesitated. Well, he ain't what he used to be. Silence. No hands went up. No murmurs of interest. Smokey closed his eyes. And then, "I'll take him." The voice was firm, female, and utterly unexpected. Heads turned. Even the auctioneer looked momentarily stunned. Jenna Carter stood at the edge of the lot, a bag slung over her shoulder, her boots covered in trail dust. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, but there was something in her stance that made her seem older, tougher. She stepped forward, eyes locked on the broken dog. "What's the price?" The auctioneer hesitated, then sighed. $100, if you really want him." Laughter rippled through the crowd. $100 for a washed-up mutt, someone snickered. "She's throwing money away." Jenna ignored them. She reached into her bag, counted out the bills, and handed them over. "Sold," the auctioneer announced, shaking his head. Jenna approached the pen, crouching beside it. "Hey there, boy," she murmured, her voice low and steady. Smokey didn't move at first. He had no reason to trust humans. Not anymore. But then she opened the gate, and instead of yanking him out like the others had, she simply sat on the ground. No force. No commands. Just patience. Smokey hesitated. He had spent his life being driven forward, pushed to his limits. But something about this woman was different. After a long moment, he lifted his head, and Jenna smiled. "Come on, big guy," she whispered. "Let's go home." The truck rattled down the icy road as Jenna stole a glance at the dog curled in the passenger seat. Smokey lay motionless, his head resting on his front paws, his breath slow and steady. He hadn't moved much since she lifted him into the cab, his body stiff with exhaustion. The past had worn him down, physically and mentally. Jenna tightened her grip on the wheel, her knuckles turning white. She had seen dogs like him before, born for speed, trained for endurance, pushed until their bodies gave out. And when they weren't fast enough anymore, when they weren't useful, they were tossed aside like broken equipment. Not this time. Not him. A light snow had started to fall as she turned onto the dirt road, leading to her cabin. The property wasn't much, just a modest wooden house, a small barn, and a fenced area where other sled dogs rested. She didn't have a big racing team like the pros, but she had enough to compete in local and mid-level races. And that was all she wanted. Jenna parked the truck and climbed out, walking around to the passenger side. When she opened the door, Smokey didn't move. He just stared at her, his amber eyes clouded with something she couldn't quite place. Fear? Resignation? Or maybe he just didn't care anymore. "Come on, boy," she said gently, reaching out. Smokey flinched. Jenna exhaled, then took a step back. "All right, no rush." She turned and walked toward the fenced-in area where the other dogs were gathered. Some perked up, ears twitching as they caught her scent. A few barked in greeting. Smokey finally lifted his head. He knew those sounds. Other dogs. A team. He had once been part of a team. Jenna gave him time. Minutes passed before he moved, slowly climbing out of the truck and onto the snowy ground. His injured leg trembled slightly, but he managed to stay upright. He sniffed the cold air, his tail hanging low but not tucked. Small steps. Jenna didn't say anything. She just watched. Then she turned and opened the gate. Smokey hesitated. He wasn't sure what this place was, what this woman wanted from him. But the other dogs watched him with curiosity, not hostility. They didn't rush him, didn't challenge him. And Jenna? She wasn't forcing him. For the first time in a long time, Smokey made a decision of his own. He stepped forward. Inside the enclosure, the other dogs gave him space, their tails wagging slightly. A young husky, lighter in color than Smokey, sniffed him curiously. Smokey stood still, letting it happen. Jenna leaned against the fence, arms crossed. Welcome home, Smokey. The next few weeks weren't easy. Smokey's legs still ached, and he struggled with simple movements. Jenna wrapped it every morning, massaging the muscles carefully. He wasn't used to kindness, wasn't used to someone taking their time with him. He didn't trust it. At first, he barely ate. He stayed away from the pack, resting alone in the farthest corner of the enclosure. Jenna let him be. She didn't rush him. She understood that trust had to be earned. And slowly, painfully, something shifted. One morning, Smokey took food from her hand instead of waiting for her to leave. A week later, he walked beside her when she did the morning rounds, his limp slightly less pronounced. And then one evening, as the Alaskan sky turned purple and gold, Jenna sat on the steps of the porch, drinking coffee in the freezing air. Smokey approached. He didn't sit next to her, didn't lean against her, but he lay down a few feet away, his amber eyes scanning the horizon like he had done 1,000 times before in the wilderness. Jenna smiled to herself. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The morning air was crisp, the kind that burned Jenna's lungs with every breath. The sky stretched in endless shades of blue above the snow-covered trees, untouched and silent. It was perfect. She glanced at Smokey, who stood a few feet away, his nose lifted toward the wind. His fur had regained some of its former luster, though his frame was still leaner than it should be. His injured leg no longer trembled as much, but he still favored it slightly. The pack had accepted him. He wasn't a leader, but he wasn't an outcast either. And for the first time in what was probably a long time, Smokey looked alive. Jenna knelt beside him, tightening the straps on the harness in her hands. You ready, big guy? Smokey flicked an ear but didn't back away. That alone was progress. For weeks, she had worked with him. Small steps, gentle routines. She never forced him into a harness, never pressured him onto the sled. But she let him watch, let him see the team in action. And Smokey had watched. Every morning when she hitched up the other dogs, he had stood at the fence, his body rigid, his ears twitching with the familiar sounds of barking, snapping lines, and runners sliding across the ice. It was in his blood. He just needed to remember it. And today, for the first time, she had approached him with a harness, and he hadn't run. She slipped it over his shoulders, adjusting the fit carefully. Smokey stood still, his muscles tight, his breath steady. Jenna exhaled softly. All right, let's take this slow. The other dogs were already hitched to the sled, waiting with restless excitement. Jenna clipped Smokey in toward the back, not leading, not setting pace, just running as part team. She stepped onto the sled runners, gripping the handlebar. Easy, guys. The dogs barked, eager to go, but they waited for her command. Smokey stood still. His body knew this. His mind, though. Jenna hesitated, then called out, "Hike!" The team lurched forward. The sled jerked. The wind rushed past. And Smokey ran. His movements were stiff at first, his stride uneven, his bad leg making him slower than the others. But he pushed forward, ears pinned back, eyes locked on trail ahead. Jenna didn't push him. She kept the pace steady, letting him find his rhythm. And after a few minutes, he did. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the way he had once run, leading teams through endless miles of ice and snow. But it was movement. It was freedom. It was a start. Jenna smiled. They ran for an hour before turning back. Smokey was exhausted by the time they reached the cabin, his sides heaving, his injured legs stiff. But as she unhooked the harness, she noticed something. His tail wagged. Not much, just a flicker. But it was there. Jenna reached out, scratching behind his ear. "Good boy, Smokey." For the first time, he leaned into her touch. That night, as the fire crackled inside the cabin, Jenna sat at the kitchen table with an open laptop in front of her. She had been thinking about it for days, and now, after the day's run, she was ready. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed. The Yukon Quest qualifiers, December 10th. A race. Not a huge one. Not the 𝐦𝐨𝐬𝐬. Not yet, but enough. Enough to see if Smokey still had it in him. Enough to prove, to both of them, that his last run hadn't been the last. She clicked register. Outside, Smokey lay curled in the snow, staring up at the stars. Somewhere in the darkness, the past still lurked. But for the first time, the future was calling. The morning of the Yukon Quest qualifiers arrived with a sharp bite in the air. The kind that froze your breath before you even saw it. The kind that settled deep in your bones and refused to let go. Jenna pulled her parka tighter as she tightened the last harness strap. The dogs were restless, their energy electric in the crisp mountain air. Snow crunched beneath boots. Sled runners scraped against packed trails, and the scent of burning wood from a distant bonfire mixed with the frost. Smokey stood among the team, his head high, his body tense. He knew what this was. This wasn't training. This was a race. Jenna reached down and scratched behind his ear. "You ready for this, big guy?" Smokey didn't move, but his eyes flicked to hers. Something burned behind them, a ghost of the past. The other mushers barely noticed Jenna at the starting line. Most of them were here to qualify for bigger races. Some were seasoned veterans, their teams sleek and built for speed. Others were rookies, eager to prove themselves. And then there was her, a small-time musher with a mixed team and a dog that should have been left for dead. Jenna ignored the sideways glances and focused on the sled, on the harnesses, on the way her hands shook as she adjusted the gangline. Nerves? Maybe. But something else twisted in her gut, too. A feeling she couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. "Jenna Doyle?" The voice came from behind her. Deep, familiar. She turned and felt the blood drain from her face. Jack Hudson, the man who had thrown Smokey away. He stood near the fence line, dressed in thick winter gear, but she would have recognized him anywhere. He wasn't alone. Another man stood beside him, younger, his jacket unzipped like he wasn't bothered by the cold. Jenna's throat tightened. "What are you doing here?" Hudson gave her that same smug, unreadable smile. "Watching the competition." Her jaw clenched. "You mean watching him?" She didn't have to look to know he meant Smokey. Hudson sighed, shoving his hands in his pockets. "Come on, kid. Let's not pretend. That dog doesn't belong to you." Jenna took a step forward, her body tense. "You left him to die." Hudson tilted his head, feigning thought. "Depends on how you look at it. He was a liability. A dog that can't pull isn't worth keeping." He nodded toward the team. "But I'll admit, I didn't think you'd get him running again." The younger guy beside him scoffed. "Barely looks like he can keep up." Jenna clenched her fists. "You're not taking him." Hudson let out a slow, condescending chuckle. "Relax. I'm not here to make a scene. The race will decide one way or another." Her heart pounded. "What the hell does that mean?" Hudson didn't answer. He just turned and walked away. The younger guy smirked at her before following. Jenna stood frozen, the roar of the crowd fading into static. Then, "Racers, to your sleds." Her head snapped up. This was it. She swallowed her fear, tightened her gloves, and turned back to Sled. Smokey was already staring at her. Like he knew, like he had always known. Jenna exhaled sharply. "Let's go show them what you're made of." She stepped onto the runners, gripped the handlebar, and called the command. "Hike!" The sled lurched forward, and Smokey ran. The sled shot forward, runners slicing through the snow as the dogs surged ahead. The world blurred into a streak of white and pine, the icy wind cutting across Jenna's face like a knife. Smokey ran like he'd never stopped, like he'd never been broken. For the first few miles, Jenna focused on rhythm. Each musher was fighting for a qualifying time, not necessarily to win, but the competition was fierce. She kept her team steady. No sprinting too soon. No burning out before the final stretch. Smokey was leading the pack like he was born for it. But then, something felt wrong. She couldn't shake it. A heaviness in the air. The way the other mushers eyed her before overtaking. The way Hudson had smirked at her before the race. Something wasn't right. Then it happened, a sharp snap, and the world tilted. The sled lurched sideways. The gang line jerked violently. Jenna barely had time to react before the sled tipped, skidding over the ice-packed snow. Her shoulders slammed against the ground. Her vision flashed white. The dogs barked wildly, their momentum dragging the sled a few more feet before it finally stopped. Silence. Jenna gasped for air. What the hell had just happened? She groaned. Pushing herself up, snow clung to her parka, her gloves. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Then she saw it. The gang line had snapped. Not frayed, not worn. Cut. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't an accident. Someone had sabotaged her sled. Smokey stood at the front, his body tense, ears pinned back. He could sense it too. Jenna scrambled toward the harnesses. The team was still together, but the main line had severed, leaving them dangerously unbalanced. If this had happened on a steep hill, they all could have gone tumbling. Footsteps. Her head snapped up. A shadow moved through the trees. A figure, bundled in thick winter gear, slipping away into the forest. She didn't see the face, but she didn't have to. She already knew. Hudson. Her blood turned to ice. He wasn't here to watch the race. He was here to end it before Smokey could prove himself. Jenna's hand shook as she worked quickly, grabbing the spare gang line from her sled bag. She had minutes before another team caught up. Her dogs whined, restless, still eager to run. Smokey turned his head, watching her, waiting. Jenna gritted her teeth, tying the last knot. They weren't done yet, not even close. She pulled herself onto the sled and gripped the handlebar. Hike! The team exploded forward, and Jenna didn't look back. The sled surged forward, cutting through the snow like a blade. Jenna's pulse pounded as she leaned into the ride, gripping the handlebar with white-knuckled determination. Smokey led the charge, his paws pounding the icy terrain with unmatched precision. If he felt the sabotage, he didn't show it. His body moved with instinct and experience, his muscles remembering the rhythm of the race. But Jenna couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her. She risked a glance over her shoulder. A lone musher trailed behind, not far, but not closing in either. Their figure was bulky under layers of gear, goggles masking their face. But Jenna knew. Hudson. She clenched her jaw. He wasn't just watching. He was waiting. For what? Her stomach twisted. The checkpoint was still a few miles ahead. If she could make it there, she'd be around officials, other mushers, people who could witness if Hudson tried anything. But that also meant he had only a few miles left to stop her. Jenna focused on the trail ahead, her breath steady despite the fire in her chest. If Hudson wanted to fight, he picked the wrong musher. The terrain turned brutal. Snow whipped sideways in a strengthening wind, cutting across the open plain like tiny daggers. The cold bit through Jenna's parka, creeping under her layers. The dogs pressed forward, their breath coming in thick, visible clouds. Then the sound of an engine. Jenna's stomach dropped. Not a sled, a snowmobile. She turned her head sharply. Hudson had veered off the main path, taking a shortcut through the woods, and now he was gaining on her fast. Jenna's heart slammed against her ribs. This wasn't just about stopping her. This was about taking Smokey. The snowmobile roared closer, kicking up a flurry of ice in its wake. Jenna's grip tightened on the handlebar. If she stopped now, it was over. If she let fear win, Hudson would get what he wanted. No, not today. She leaned forward. Hike! The team exploded forward, Smokey setting a punishing pace. The world blurred around them as the sled flew over the frozen ground. Hudson's engine screamed behind her. The race had turned into a chase, and she wasn't about to lose. The roar of Hudson's snowmobile grew deafening, the vibrations of the engine rumbling to the frozen ground. Jenna's team surged forward, their paws striking the snow in perfect sync. Smokey led with unwavering focus, his body moving with the speed and grace of the champion he was born to be. But it wasn't just about speed anymore. It was about survival. Jenna's breath came in sharp bursts as she risked another glance over her shoulder. Hudson was gaining. Fast. His machine cut through the terrain with brutal efficiency, sending a spray of ice into the air. The checkpoint was close, just a few miles ahead. If she could reach it, she'd be surrounded by race officials and other mushers. Hudson wouldn't dare try anything in front of them. But then she saw it. A sharp curve ahead, leading into a narrow ravine. A bad feeling settled in her gut. Something wasn't right. Smokey, sensing the same danger, let out a sharp bark. His ears pinned back as he adjusted his footing, his body tense with awareness. Jenna's instincts screamed. Hudson wasn't just chasing her. He was hurting her, forcing her toward that ravine. A trap. Jenna had seconds to decide. If she followed the trail, she'd be at Hudson's mercy. The ravine was narrow and steep. He could easily block the exit and cut her off, but if she veered off course, she swallowed hard. The deep powder off the main trail was unpredictable, dangerous. Sleds weren't built for it. One wrong move, and she could flip. Her dogs could get hurt. But if she didn't take the risk, Hudson would win, and she'd lose everything. Her grip tightened on the sled. There was no time for fear, only action. She sucked in a breath, locked eyes with Smokey, and shouted the command. "Ha!" Smokey didn't hesitate. He veered left, off the marked path, plowing into deep, untouched snow. The rest of the team followed, their bodies pushing through the heavy powder with sheer strength and will. Jenna's sled bucked wildly, the runners sinking into the snow. She bent her knees, absorbing the shock, shifting her weight to keep them upright. Her heart slammed against her ribs. This was reckless, crazy, but it was working. Hudson's snowmobile roared past a turn, too fast to follow. By the time he realized she wasn't taking the bait, it was too late. He skidded, cursing loudly, his machine fishtailing before coming to an abrupt stop. Jenna didn't slow down, didn't look back. She forced her team forward, racing against time. The checkpoint was just ahead. If she could make it, this nightmare would finally be over. Jenna's sled bounced violently over the deep powder, the runners struggling to stay afloat in the fresh, untouched snow. Every muscle in her body screamed as she fought for balance, her hands gripping the handlebar like a lifeline. She couldn't slow down, not with Hudson so close behind. The deep snow had forced him to skid past a turn, but he wasn't giving up. Jenna heard the high-pitched whine of his snowmobile as he circled back, his headlights slashing through thickening snowfall. "Come on, guys. Faster," she urged, her voice raw from the cold. Smokey surged forward, his powerful body carving a path through the snow, the rest of the team pushing hard behind him. They were exhausted. Jenna could hear it in their breaths, see it in the way their muscles trembled with effort. But they weren't stopping. Not now. Ahead, the dense snow-covered forest gave way to an open stretch of frozen lake. The surface was a mix of slick ice and wind-blown powder, treacherous for a sled team at high speed. Jenna's stomach tightened. It was risky, but it was her only chance. If she stayed in the thick snow, Hudson would eventually catch up. His machine would cut through it far easier than her sled could. But the ice? That was different. Snowmobiles weren't built for sheer ice. Their traction depended on the powder. If Hudson hit a frozen patch at full speed, she swallowed. He'd wipe out. Hard. Jenna sucked in a breath and made the call. "Straight ahead, guys. Let's go." Smokey hesitated for a split second, his instincts warning him of the danger ahead. But when Jenna gave the command again, he trusted her. He always did. With one final bound, the team hit the ice. Skating on the edge, Jenna bent her knees, keeping her weight centered as the sled's runners slid dangerously across the slick surface. Her heart hammered. One wrong move, one loss of control, and they'd spin out. Behind her, Hudson's snowmobile roared closer. Then, the sound she was waiting for, the sputter of skidding treads. The moment Hudson's machine hit the frozen lake, it struggled for traction. The heavy snowmobile fishtailed, the back end whipping out from under him. No! Hudson bellowed. Jenna didn't look back. She didn't need to. She heard the crash, the sickening scrape of metal against ice, the thud of a body slamming into the frozen ground. Then silence. Hudson was down. Jenna didn't slow, didn't hesitate. The checkpoint was just ahead. A cluster of warm lights, race officials, and safety crews waiting at the next rest stop. "Almost there, guys," she whispered, barely able to breathe. Smokey pulled harder, his ears flicking back to listen for her. And then they crossed the threshold into safety. Jenna nearly collapsed with relief. She had made it, but this wasn't over yet. Jenna barely had time to catch her breath before the race officials swarmed her. "Jenna, what the hell is going on?" One of the judges, a burly man in a red parka, strode toward her, his radio crackling with frantic voices. "We got reports of a snowmobile chasing you down the trail." It was Hudson. Jenna gasped, her voice raw from the cold and adrenaline. She staggered off the sled, her knees buckling. "He tried to stop me, tried to take Smokey." The officials exchanged looks of alarm. From behind them, another voice cut through the chaos. "Hey, over here." A safety officer waved frantically from the edge of the frozen lake. Two men were hauling a battered, groaning Hudson off the ice. His snowmobile lay in a crumpled heap, smoke curling from its busted engine. Jenna's pulse pounded. He was alive, and she wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Hudson staggered forward, one hand clutching his bruised ribs. His jacket was torn, his face bloody from the crash. But when he saw Jenna, his glare burned hotter than ever. "You!" he spat, his breath fogging the air. "You think you've won?" Jenna squared her shoulders, refusing to back down. "I have won, Hudson. It's over." The race officials turned toward him, confusion shifting into suspicion. "What you talking about?" Hudson let out a bitter laugh. "You really think anyone's going to believe her over me? A kid with a washed-up sled dog." He shot a glare at Smokey, who stood tall despite his exhaustion, his piercing blue eyes locked on Hudson. "That mutt was mine. I had every right to take him back." A hush fell over the checkpoint. Jenna's fists clenched. "You abandoned him," she seethed. "You dumped him like garbage because he got injured, because he wasn't winning you money anymore." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "And now that he's proving you wrong, now that he's showing the world he's not broken, you suddenly want him back." Hudson's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, another voice joined the conversation. "She's telling the truth." Jenna turned. One of the other mushers had stepped forward, a woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp green eyes. "I remember Smokey," she said, looking at Hudson with pure disdain. "He was the best lead dog you ever had. And I also remember when you cut him from your team." More voices murmured in agreement. "I remember that, too. He was limping during the qualifiers last year, and then, poof, he was gone." A tall man in a Canada Goose jacket shook his head. Didn't take a genius to figure out what happened. Hudson's face twisted with fury. "I didn't." But it was too late. The officials had heard enough. One of them, a woman in a thick navy coat, turned toward Jenna. "We'll need a full statement from you. But if everything checks out," she shot a cold look at Hudson, "you won't be racing in this circuit ever again." A wave of relief crashed over Jenna, so hard she thought she might collapse. It was over. 2 hours later, after the officials had taken her statement and Hudson had been taken for medical treatment, Jenna sat with Smokey in a heated tent near the checkpoint. She ran her fingers through his thick fur, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady rise and fall of his breath. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. But one final question lingered in her mind. What now? She had risked everything to save Smokey, to give him a chance. But she had never truly considered what came next. Smokey had nothing to prove anymore. He had already shown his strength, his spirit. He didn't need to race. And maybe neither did she. Jenna swallowed, pressing her forehead against his. "What do you think, boy?" One last run. Smokey's ears twitched. Then, slowly, his tail wagged. Jenna smiled. They weren't done just yet. The night was long, filled with endless questions from race officials, murmurs from the other mushers, and the occasional sharp glance from those who still didn't quite believe what had happened. But Jenna had one thing on her mind. The race wasn't over. She sat outside the heated tent, her breath misting in the freezing air. Smokey lay beside her, curled up in a tight ball, his thick Alaskan Husky coat keeping him warm. His eyes flickered open as she shifted. "Hey, boy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "You think we've got one last run in us?" Smokey let out a soft huff, his tail thumping once against the snow. A small smile tugged at Jenna's lips. That was all the answer she needed. By dawn, Jenna had made her decision. She marched straight to the race official's tent and made her case. "I want to finish." The judges exchanged glances. "Jenna, after everything that's happened, I need to finish," she insisted. "I know we're behind, but if you let me go, I'll make up the time." One of the judges sighed. "Your team has been through a lot. Are they even in shape to keep going?" Jenna turned, motioning toward her sled dogs. They were lined up outside, rested and ready. Even Smokey, despite the exhaustion of the chase with Hudson, stood tall at the front of the line, ears perked and tail wagging. "They're ready," she said firmly. "And so am I." There was a long pause. Then, "All right." Jenna's heart leapt. "You'll be released back onto the trail with a time adjustment," the official explained. "You've got a hell of a gap to close, but if anyone can do it," he glanced at Smokey, "it's that dog." Jenna grinned, gripping Smokey's harness. "Damn right." Back on the trail, Jenna's adrenaline surged as she pushed her team forward. The cold air stung her cheeks. The wind howled past her, and the sled cut through the snow like a knife. She was running last, but she wasn't running scared. The trail ahead was brutal. Steep hills, narrow turns, and long stretches of open tundra where the wind threatened to push her back. But Jenna knew this course. More importantly, Smokey knew this course. His paws hit the snow with a steady rhythm, his breath coming in controlled bursts. He was limping slightly, but he pushed through, leading the team with the kind of fire that had made him a legend. Jenna leaned forward, urging them on. "Come on, Smokey. Let's show them what you've got." The team surged ahead. One by one, Jenna passed the slower mushers, their eyes widening as she shot past them. The exhaustion that clung to her body disappeared, replaced with pure focus. Smokey's ears flicked back, as if listening to her heartbeat. They were in sync. They were unstoppable. And then, in the distance, the final checkpoint. Jenna's chest tightened as she spotted the sled in front of her. Only one team remained between her and the finish line. It was 𝐤𝐸𝐤𝐿, one of the top mushers in the circuit. A man who had never lost a race he had entered. His team was powerful, his lead dog a beast of muscle and speed. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Jenna closing in. His eyes narrowed. Jenna gritted her teeth. "Smokey, we need one last push, boy." Smokey's ears flicked forward. His body trembled with exhaustion, but then he let out a sharp bark, rallying the team. He dug his paws into the snow and ran. Faster, harder, past the howling wind, past the pain. The finish line was just ahead. Ryan's team surged forward, desperate to hold on to their lead. Jenna could hear the shouts from the crowd gathering near the final marker. Her heart pounded. This was it. Everything they'd fought for, everything Smokey had endured, came down to this moment. With one last burst of speed, Smokey pulled ahead, his muscles burning, his breath ragged. Jenna gripped the sled, leaning forward as they crossed the final stretch. And then, the sound of the race horn, the roar of the crowd. Jenna's sled skidded to a stop just past the finish line. Silence. Then an official stepped forward, checking the race footage. Jenna held her breath. Calloway's sled was just inches behind hers. Had they done it? The official turned toward the crowd, lifted his radio, and announced, "Jenna Owens and her team have won by less than a second." The world seemed to explode around her. People were cheering. Cameras flashed. The sound of applause and shouts filled the air. Jenna barely registered it. All she could see was Smokey. He stood at the front of the team, his legs shaking, his chest rising and falling in rapid breaths. She ran forward, dropping to her knees in the snow, wrapping her arms around him. "You did it," she whispered, burying her face in his thick fur. "You did it, Smokey. You proved them all wrong." The husky let out a tired, happy huff, his tail wagging weakly. For the first time in a long time, Smokey wasn't running for survival. He was running for himself. And he had won. The weight of victory didn't hit Jenna until she was standing on the podium, the crisp Alaskan air filling her lungs as she looked out at the roaring crowd. She had done it. They had done it. The trophy gleamed in the sunlight, but Jenna barely glanced at it. Instead, she crouched down and wrapped her arms around Smokey, pressing her forehead gently against his. "You're the real champion," she whispered. Smokey huffed in response, his tail swishing weakly. His legs were still trembling from exhaustion, but there was a spark in his eyes, a quiet, unshakable pride. The officials finished their announcements, calling Jenna's name as the first-place winner of the Northern Lights Sled Dog Derby. Ryan Calloway, standing to her right in second place, gave her a short nod. "You earned it," he admitted. Jenna met his gaze and saw something unexpected. Respect. "Thanks," she said. "You gave me a hell of a race." Calloway smirked. "Your lead dog is a legend. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jenna turned back to Smokey, her chest swelling with pride. She didn't need anyone to tell her that. She already knew. The celebrations carried on late into the night, but Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Smokey had given her everything. He had fought through pain, exhaustion, and betrayal to prove that he was still the incredible sled dog he had always been. But she also knew the truth. His best days on the trail were behind him. Sitting outside her cabin later that evening, she ran a hand through his thick fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. His body was sore, his joints stiff, signs of a dog who had pushed himself past his limits. He had nothing left to prove. Jenna exhaled and made her decision. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "What do you think about retirement?" Smokey lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching. She chuckled softly. I know. You'd run forever if I let you. But I think it's time you get to just be a dog." Smokey blinked at her, then let out a low sigh and rested his head on her lap. Jenna smiled. "Yeah, I thought so." The next morning, Jenna made the arrangements. She had spent years chasing races, traveling from town to town with her sled dogs. It was the only life she had ever known. But for Smokey, she wanted something different, something permanent. And she knew exactly where that would be. A week later, she drove to the foothills outside Fairbanks, where an old friend was waiting. "Are you sure about this?" Mike asked, glancing down at Smokey. Jenna nodded. "He deserves it." Mike's ranch was a haven for retired sled dogs. Sprawling fields, warm barns, and a team of veterinarians who made sure every dog spent their golden years in comfort. Smokey stood beside Jenna, his tail wagging as he sniffed the crisp air. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, he was simply at peace. Jenna knelt beside him and cupped his face in her hands. "I'm not saying goodbye," she whispered. "Just see you later." Smokey licked her nose, making her laugh. Then, with one last wag of his tail, he trotted off toward the ranch, where a new life awaited him. Jenna watched him go, her heart aching, but also full. Some dogs were meant to race. Smokey had been one of the greatest. But now, he had finally found something even better, a place to call home. Years later, Jenna found herself back at the Northern Lights Sled Dog Derby. She wasn't racing this time. Instead, she stood at the starting line, watching a new generation of mushers take their places. Beside her, a young girl tightened her grip on the sled's handlebars, excitement dancing in her eyes. "Think they're ready, and Jenna?" she asked. Jenna smiled. "They've got the best teacher in the world." The girl grinned and gave a quick command to her team. At the front of the pack, leading the sled with boundless energy, was a young Alaskan Husky, his fur a familiar blend of gray and white, his golden eyes sharp with determination, a pup from Smokey's lineage. Jenna's chest swelled with pride. The race horn blew, and the team took off, kicking up a spray of fresh snow. As Jenna watched them disappear into the wilderness, she whispered under her breath, "Run like hell, kid," because some legends never truly fade. They just keep running.